Okay, now things start to get a little more complicated here because I want to make the crossbones, sort of like for my Jolly Roger flag, the skull and crossbones. So I'll start out by having a bone rectangle, right? That'll be the long part of the bone. And then I'll have the knobs of the bone, but I want to have four knobs in a row that are located in different positions. And then finally, I will want those to be contained by a parent element called bone that has certain kinds of positioning that's different for each bone. So you can see things starting to get complicated here. So let's go one piece at a time. Okay, so there's my comment. So I have bone rectangle and bone knob, again positioned absolutely, and so on. I'll save it and head over here. And you can see that these are not contained by skull, and in fact they come before skull. And the reason for that is I want those bones to lay behind the skull, right? So first the web page renders this bone, then this bone, and then skull goes on top of it, so they drop into the back. So let's expand the first one, and we can see that within the parent element bone, which also has a class we'll talk about in a bit, we have bone rectangle and then four instances of bone knob, each with a different class. So I'll reload this on the page. Okay, so initially our bone is gray. Our bone is too long for the background div, but we'll take care of that in a second because we're actually going to rotate this thing. And we're also missing our knobs. So let's go take a look and see why that is. That's because our classes are down here beneath the comment. So if you think about it, the div ID, well, something you should know about it is that the div ID always takes precedent over the class. So even if I have a class, or rather if I ever have a class and an ID that are in competition, the ID will always win no matter when I define the class. Unless, of course, the class is more specific than the ID. So here I've taken my left and top positioning characteristics and I've pulled them out of the ID, right? Normally in an ID we would see those positioning characteristics here, but instead I've pulled them out and put them into a class. So bone knob is not really going to do anything by itself, but the combination of the ID bone knob and the class knob lock or knob location means that now I can have four identical instances of the same shape that'll occur in different places. And so I can bring these in one at a time just to sort of show you how this is going to look. Right, so there's my first knob. So that one had to start here at 0 and then move back -25 and up -25. And if we take a look here at Adam, we can see that there. Now my next one, for location number 2, is going to go all the way across to the right-hand side. So it's 375 pixels from the left, but still only 25 pixels from the top. So I'll reload that, and I can see that one's over here in this corner. And then I'll just bring the other two as well. So you do the math, and in some cases the math doesn't work and you sort of noodle around with the numbers, but you want to be as precise as possible, otherwise things will look like you just place them haphazardly. If we take a look back in the index now, we can see the div ID is repeated 4 times, but in each case that ID has a different class associated with it, which is why I'll get 4 little bone knobs like that. Okay, so this is starting to look pretty good. Now we want to reposition this thing and also rotate it. And that's part of the reason that I have all of this material contained within the parent element bone with the class bone. Let's take a look at why I did that. Okay, so initially the container bone, all it says is that position is relative as opposed to absolute, right? And then down here there's 2 classes. So in this case we transform and rotate by 30 degrees. And in this case, bone 2, we transform and rotate by -30 degrees. And then the positioning top and left is a little different in each case. So here if I comment so that I just get the first class, we can see the rotation take an effect. It goes like that. Now this is the other instance that has not been rotated yet. So I'll head back to Adam, and we will allow bone 2, the class, to be defined. And now that one gets rotated in the opposite direction and repositioned. So now we're really starting to head somewhere. And in fact, I think I might go ahead and get rid of my white box in the background. So back up to here, get rid of background, save it, and reload it. And we can start to see, so this is a pure CSS graphic, right? That means it plays really well on the web. And you certainly can make something like this in Photoshop, but I think particularly because you're getting started out in coding, it's really good practice to see what you can make just with code and nothing else. And also, it's just going to make you a lot better at CSS, right? Going through these steps. I think also, too, you get more creative when you have these sorts of limitations. Like if I just have boxes effectively, although there are ways to make triangles and so forth if you dig around, sometimes you overlap colors to make a shape look more complicated than it is. But it's really nice when you start to break away from that rectangle in the background, right? Okay, so just a couple more things here in terms of positioning before we move on to animation. Back in my CSS, I have my bone knob, my bone knob location, etc., etc. Okay, and now we're starting to get towards animation. So I'll come in here and open up the pupil, because this is the thing we're going to animate. So ignore this stuff for the moment. The rest of this should look very familiar. Position absolute. Now, because pupil is a child of eye, remember, if we look skull, eye, and pupil, they're all nested together. That means that the pupil's position is just relative to the eye. I think I forgot to save it. I sure did. So this is just like a little white glint on the inside of my eye. Okay, so hopefully you get the idea. You saw my version at the beginning of this video where I took a lot more time to make that skull face look skull-like and put in teeth and so forth. But this isn't about me. This is all for you all to learn. So this is definitely an example of do as I say and not as I do. It's up to you to come up with something really interesting. Perhaps you make a self-portrait. Perhaps you make an animal. Perhaps you make an animated logo or something like that. And then you're going to pick some elements to animate, whether it's color or position or size and so forth. And that's what we'll talk about in the next video.